So really quick, I want to apologize. I had to split this last section up into two parts again. I'm having some slight memory issues with my computer, so I apologize for that, since originally in the very first lecture I told you it would just be two parts. So this will be the last portion that you will have for the urinary system. So let's go ahead and pick up right where we left off. So again, we just left off talking about countercurrent multiplication and how that countercurrent multiplication is important for creating this osmotic gradient here that you see that really, again, drives that process of reabsorption, especially of water in the ascending or the descending limb, and then the reabsorption of salt in the ascending limb. So remember, here's the descending limb, here's the ascending limb. Again, the ascending limb is where we got salt reabsorption that created this osmotic gradient, and then here, that osmotic gradient is then used to draw water off via osmosis in the descending limb. So again, a very, very cool process in terms of how the kidneys function in such a efficient manner. So again, if we were to look at the kidney, what's cool is, let me go ahead and get my pen here real quick. But if you look at the kidneys, what's really amazing is that you can see here's the kidney, the whole kidney itself, here's the cortex, and then here's the medulla, and they drew in the osmolarities that you would find basically across the kidneys. And what you'll find is in the cortex, again, your osmolarity is fairly low, and in the medulla, the osmolarity gradually gets higher and higher. Now remember, the reason is that if you could picture all of your nephrons, again, and you have, just thousands upon thousands of nephrons in the kidney here. So if you could picture all of these nephrons are going to look like this with a proximal convoluted tubule and then the loop of Henle. Oops, whoa. It's a big loop of Henle there. The loop of Henle dumping down in here, and then here the distal convoluted tubule, and then the collecting duct here. So again, you can see that the loop of Henle, okay, again, is going to dip down here in the medulla, and that's what's responsible for creating this concentration gradient here, for that osmotic gradient here, for reabsorption. And again, it's because of the countercurrent multiplication that's what creates this gradient in the kidneys. So again, now depending upon the body's state of hydration at any point in time, the kidneys can secrete urine of varying concentrations. And that's because, again, the concentrations that we're going to find here in the interstitium and then also inside the filtrate are going to be dependent upon how hydrated we are, or again, how dehydrated we are. So again, these concentrations will vary depending upon how hydrated our body is. And so again, that will help to maintain our certain body fluid inside our blood, so a certain pressure inside our blood. And that's really what the kidneys want to ensure, is that we don't want to draw out too much fluid, right, out of the blood and dump it as urine. And then we also don't want to draw out too little. So again, the kidneys help to regulate, again, our fluid, basically our fluid pressure within our blood. So again, we see a large vertical osmotic gradient, that's what you're seeing here, is established in the interstitial fluid of the medulla. And again, this is because of the countercurrent exchange or countercurrent multiplication. Okay, so regulation of urine concentration and volume. So we're going to talk about, again, some of the things that regulate the urine concentration volume. Most of the sodium ions are reabsorbed before the urine is excreted. Okay, so again, we're not excreting that much sodium. We're reabsorbing most of that sodium. And the sodium is concentrated in the renal medulla, just like you saw, by the countercurrent mechanism. Now, normally, the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts are impermeable to water unless the hormone ADH is present. Okay, and so this is where we're going to get into some of the facultative absorption. Okay, so again, we have the obligatory reabsorption, which is again water being obliged to move with sodium, and then we had the facultative, where we get water reabsorption due to hormones. And this is how that's going to happen, is these hormones are going to affect the permeability of the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, and how permeable they are to water. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about, don't worry, we're coming back to that facultative water reabsorption here in just a minute. But what I want to kind of introduce here along with that is that we're going to be talking about now what's happening in the later tubule segments. So again, we've talked about the proximal convoluted tubule, again, being our site for the majority of our reabsorption of salts and water. And then we talked about reabsorption, some of that extra water reabsorption that we get in the loop of Henle, as well as some salt reabsorption. Now we're going to be talking about what's happening in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. These are those later tubules, okay? The distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. And the important thing to remember about these two areas is that the membrane permeabilities are variable, meaning that the membrane permeabilities can change depending upon what hormones are released. So our membrane permeabilities can be changed by changing hormonal levels, okay, and some physiological conditions. But we're going to talk mainly about, again, how hormones can impact the permeability of these membranes. So let's talk about some of these hormones. And again, when we're talking about hormones, just real quick, as a reminder, when we're talking about hormones influencing the permeability of these later tubules, we're talking about facultative reabsorption of water. Okay. So our first hormone that we're going to talk about is aldosterone. And aldosterone is going to be a hormone that actually increases sodium reabsorption. And because it increases sodium reabsorption, you got it, water is going to follow. Okay, so water is going to follow with it. It also increases potassium secretion. So you can see potassium is being secreted in the opposite direction here. So this reminds me, I kind of need to introduce another term. So we've mostly been talking about reabsorption, right? Reabsorption of things that are moving, from the filtrate back into the blood. Now we're also going to introduce in these later tubules, okay, secretion, because that's mainly where secretion is going to happen. And secretion means that we're going to be moving things from the blood into the filtrate. Okay, so that's secretion. And as you can see here, aldosterone is a hormone that increases potassium secretion. So potassium is actually going to be secreted from the blood and then into the interstitium and then moved across the tubule cells and into the filtrate, okay, and then be excreted as urine. So aldosterone is going to increase sodium and water reabsorption and, in the other direction, increase potassium secretion. And it's going to do this by, this is a little more than you have to know. I mean, this gets a little bit nitty-gritty, but for some of you, it's nice to know the mechanism on how this happens. So I'm just going to give it to you. And it does this by stimulating the synthesis of new pumps. So what it does is it puts new pumps in here. So that way then we can pump more sodium, okay, across in this direction. We can pump more potassium across in this direction. So that's when, you might wonder, how does aldosterone increase sodium reabsorption? That's how it does it. It increases, again, the number of these sodium pumps that you have here. Okay. So, and real quick, I just want to mention something else I forgot to mention here. If we are, again, actively pumping more sodium across, okay, here, then we're going to actively be pumping more water as well. And so if we're pumping water across and reabsorbing more water into the blood, that means that there is less water, right? If there's more water being reabsorbed in the blood, now there's less water in the filtrate. And that means that there will ultimately be less filtrate and less urine output, okay? So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so another hormone that we're going to talk about is ANP, or atrial natriuretic peptide. And this hormone is going to do just the opposite of aldosterone. So you can kind of remember it in that way, in that it's doing just the opposite. It's actually going to inhibit reabsorption of sodium. And so if it's inhibiting reabsorption of sodium, then we're not going to be reabsorbing water either, right? Because that water moves with the sodium. And it does this primarily in the proximal convoluted tubule, and it also, on top of it, is going to suppress secretion of aldosterone. Okay, so again, that's why it's opposing aldosterone. And on top of it, it even inhibits the secretion of aldosterone and antidiuretic hormone, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. And so what this is going to do is, if we're not reabsorbing sodium, then we have more sodium hanging out in the filtrate, right? And that means ultimately we have more sodium hanging out in our urine. And so this is going to increase our overall excretion of sodium in our urine, and therefore it's going to increase our urine output as well. Because remember, if in that tubule, okay, now we have sodium staying in the filtrate instead of being pumped out into the blood. If now it's staying in the filtrate, then it's going to keep the water with it, because that water that would have moved via obligatory reabsorption with the sodium is now no longer obliged to move, right? If sodium's staying, then the water is going to stay with it. So it's not going to move down that osmotic gradient if we don't have sodium moving across. So that's important to remember, that now we have more water staying here in the filtrate, and ultimately, again, that's going to make up our urine. So what that means is, then as we have more water, we have more urine output, okay, more fluid in our filtrate and more urine output. And what this does is this helps decrease our blood volume. So, for example, in an individual that may have, again, high blood pressure, this is one of the hormones that should naturally bring your blood pressure back down. Now, again, in an individual that has high blood pressure, oftentimes that's an abnormal case, and so there's some type of underlying disease that's causing that high blood pressure. So, but in a normal individual, atrial natriuretic peptide will help control blood pressure, and as your blood pressure starts to creep up, okay, then we'll release ANP, and that helps to decrease our overall blood volume and help us to maintain a normal blood pressure. Okay, and then we have one of my favorites to talk about, antidiuretic hormone. So what antidiuretic hormone does is it actually increases the water permeability of the tubule cells, so that way then we can get more water reabsorption in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts. So this will happen in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts. And again, how it does this is really cool. All it does is it stimulates the insertion of these little pores called aquaporins, and they're just like they sound. They're literally pores that allow aqua, or water, through. So what happens is antidiuretic hormone will, in the nephron, here's a little tiny nephron, right? In the nephron, it will actually put these little aquaporins in the distal convoluted tubule and then in the collecting duct. So that way then we can get more water reabsorption in those two areas. So that's the main function of antidiuretic hormone. And just so you know, antidiuretic hormone will also be called vasopressin. For the purposes of this class, let's just call it antidiuretic hormone, right? You have enough to remember. But you may also in future classes hear it called vasopressin, and just know that it's the same thing, okay? So antidiuretic hormone, again, is going to increase the permeability, just like I told you in the previous slide, in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, okay? So the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. And it's going to make those cells there more permeable to water. And so, and an osmotic gradient already exists, if you remember, outside the tubules, because that was already established by the loop of Henle's. All the loop of Henle's that are going through, there's tons of them, right, in that area, have already established an osmotic gradient in that interstitium. So that osmotic gradient already exists due to that countercurrent multiplication. So we already have the osmotic gradient. All we need is those aquaporins to let the water through. And when we have the hormone like ADH that stimulates those aquaporins to be put in, then boom, water can now move by osmosis, okay? And so now more water can be reabsorbed. So that's exactly what's happening with ADH, is that in these later tubules, if I can draw my nephron one more time here, here's proximal convoluted tubule, loop of Henle. You guys should be able to do this from heart now too. And then the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. So it's in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct that, again, these aquaporins, boom, are put in. And now we can reabsorb water into the blood. And so keep in mind that, again, if water is being reabsorbed, then there's less fluid in the filtrate. And that means if there's less water in the filtrate, then that leads to less urine output. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone is just a hormone that ensures that we are not urinating out too much water. So it helps to maintain some of that water that we need in our blood. So that's the main purpose of antidiuretic hormone. Now, what's kind of cool about antidiuretic hormone is many of you have probably experienced what happens when antidiuretic hormone is inhibited. And alcohol is responsible for inhibiting the release of antidiuretic hormone. So when you drink alcohol, you inhibit the release of ADH. Okay? And if you inhibit the release of ADH, then we're not going to put these aquaporins in. Okay? And that means that more of the water is staying in the filtrate. That also means that then you have more water in your urine. So that means that you have a higher urine output when you inhibit this hormone. Okay? If you inhibit this hormone, then you're going to have to urinate more. And that's, some of you may have experienced that and you weren't imagining it. When you drink, you're going to urinate more. Okay? Now, you also probably know that one of the main causes of your hangover, your headache from your hangover, is that you actually become dehydrated, a little dehydrated. And the reason is that, again, you're not reabsorbing as much water into the blood without that antidiuretic hormone. So then you're, again, getting rid of more of that water. And so to help prevent, now that you understand this, if you want to help try to prevent that headache from occurring, that hangover, one of the best things that you can do is to drink lots of water. And that's because, again, you have to replace this water that's not being reabsorbed here. So you need to drink a plentiful supply of water, especially, again, after you stop drinking, you're going to start releasing antidiuretic hormone again, and you'll get some more extra water reabsorption there. So again, you didn't think you were going to learn anything really valuable tonight, I know, and now look at this. Very valuable information, right? Very useful information. So anyway, that always is a fun topic to talk about. So when we talk about water reabsorption as a whole, okay, keep in mind that about 65% of your water reabsorption is going to be obligatory water reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule, okay? And then another 15%, okay, is going to be obligatory, okay, obligatory in the loop of Henle. Okay, that's where we get that about 80% of our water reabsorption is obligatory, okay? So, but this gives you some numbers to put to it now. So you can see that about 65% of that happens in the proximal convoluted tubule. That's why I said most of your reabsorption happens there. Another 15%, that's a good amount, 15% happens in the loop of Henle. And again, that's obligatory. Remember, obligatory just means as we move sodium across and sodium's reabsorbed, the water is obliged to move with it, okay, down its osmotic gradient. So these are both obligatory. But in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct, okay, water reabsorption is going to be all facultative. It's all going to be dependent upon, again, the release of hormones. And the big one is antidiuretic hormone. Okay? So antidiuretic hormone is one of the main hormones responsible for facultative reabsorption of water. Okay, so again, aldosterone plays a part, and AMP plays a part as well, but antidiuretic hormone is the biggie. So now let's talk a little bit about secretion. Oops, sorry about that. And so when we talk about secretion, remember we're going to be talking about substances that we're moving from the blood back into the filtrate so that it can be excreted as urine. And urea and uric acid, okay, both will be secreted so that, again, some of this urea and some of the uric acid will then be excreted as urine. So urea is just a byproduct of amino acid metabolism. So again, it's just one of the byproducts of breaking down proteins and amino acids. And then uric acid is a byproduct of breaking down nucleic acids, or what we call nucleic acid metabolism. So again, this would be breaking down DNA, the nucleotides that make up DNA and RNA. Okay? So these, again, are just byproducts of those two metabolic processes. Now, urea, some of the urea will be passively reabsorbed by diffusion. So we'll reabsorb about 50% of the urea, but about 50% of the urea that we originally secreted, okay, into the filtrate will actually be excreted. Okay, so again, and that's a fair amount. So about half of your urea is being excreted in your urine. And then most of your uric acid will be reabsorbed by active transport. However, small amounts are going to be secreted into the renal tubules, into those later renal tubules. And so again, then that once it's secreted into the filtrate, then it will be excreted as urine. Okay? So those are, again, some substances that are secreted and will be excreted as urine. So tubular secretion, again, just means that we're transporting certain substances from the plasma into the renal tubules. Okay, and that's what I've been kind of talking about here with talking about when we talk about excretion, okay, then oftentimes we're talking about things that are being secreted. There are things that originally were filtered in the glomerulus and the renal corpuscle, but again, we also have things that are secreted that will be secreted in these later tubules and will stay in the filtrate. So tubular secretion is that. Tubular secretion means things are moving from the blood, okay, from the plasma of blood into the renal tubules to be excreted. Active transport mechanisms will move something like hydrogen ions, okay, excess hydrogen ions, into the renal tubules. So hydrogen ions are one of the big things that we're going to see are secreted into these later tubules. So hydrogen ions are moved out of the blood and then into the renal tubules and into the filtrate so they can be excreted. And that's to help us regulate our blood pH so that we don't have too many hydrogen ions, which would make our blood more acidic. And then potassium ions are also going to be secreted both actively and passively in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting duct. Okay? So potassium ions will also be secreted into the filtrate and then excreted as urine. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to take a few moments to just do an overview, okay? And I have a nice animation that's going to go with this. So if you look here in the proximal convoluted tubule, this is where you're getting most of your reabsorption, again, of ions and water. You get a few things that are secreted, okay? But mostly you're getting mostly reabsorption here. Then in the loop of Henle, remember in the descending limb, we're reabsorbing water. In the ascending limb, we're reabsorbing salt. And then in the distal convoluted tubule, we'll get more reabsorption of water, okay? But remember, this is going to be facultative due to hormones. Okay? And then we also get some reabsorption of some salt and some other ions here. But this is also where we're going to get most of our secretion of potassium and hydrogen ions. Okay, so again, we can see potassium, just like we talked about in the previous slide, potassium and hydrogen ions are going to be secreted into the filtrate. And then here we'll see that we get reabsorption in the collecting ducts of some salts and again of water, mainly again due to that facultative reabsorption due to hormones, especially antidiuretic hormone. So again, ADH is the big one here, okay, responsible for this. And you'll also get some reabsorption of urea, okay, as well. And so that's going to happen in the collecting ducts. So again, this is just a nice overview slide of where you're getting reabsorption of some of these different substances, of some of the ions and some of the water. So what I want to do now is to play this quick animation for you. And again, I'm also going to post this animation for you separately so that you can get to it, because this animation is probably one of my favorite animations, and that it kind of covers everything. So take the time to listen to this animation, because it really will kind of put everything together for you. So give it just a second here to load. Okay, and so again, you'll just click on the narrated animation so you can...
The major excretory organ of mammals is the kidney. Humans have 2 kidneys located in the upper rear region of the abdominal cavity. The urine they produce is conducted to the urinary bladder through the ureters. The urethra drains the bladder. The internal structure of the kidney includes an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The ureter divides into branches, the ends of which envelop medullary tissues called renal pyramids. The actual work of the kidney is carried out by functional units called nephrons. Each human kidney contains about 1 million nephrons. Each nephron consists of vascular and tubule components. An afferent arteriole carries blood to a knot of capillaries called the glomerulus. Draining each glomerulus is an efferent arteriole that gives rise to the paratubular capillaries, most of which surround the cortical portions of the nephron tubules. Blood pressure forces water and small molecules to be filtered from the glomerulus and collected in Bowman's capsule. The initial segment of a renal tubule is called the proximal convoluted tubule. The glomerulus, Bowman's capsule, and proximal convoluted tubule of each nephron are located in the cortex. From the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron tubule turns down into the medulla. The portion of the tubule in the medulla is called the loop of Henle. Where the ascending limb of the loop of Henle reaches the cortex, it becomes the distal convoluted tubule. The distal convoluted tubules of many nephrons join a common collecting duct in the cortex. The collecting ducts then run in parallel with the loops of Henle down through the medulla and empty into the ureter at the tips of the renal pyramids. A few paratubular capillaries run into the medulla in parallel with the loop of Henle and the collecting duct and form the vasa recta. These capillaries carry away the molecules that are reabsorbed from the tubules. All of the paratubular capillaries join back together into a venule that eventually leads to the renal vein. Nephrons regulate the composition of blood and urine by a combination of filtration, secretion, and reabsorption. Viewed schematically, we will see how these processes are facilitated by the regular arrangement of segments of the nephron. The proximal convoluted tubule is responsible for most of the reabsorption of water and solutes from the glomerular filtrate. The cells of this section of the nephron actively transport sodium ions and other solutes, such as glucose and amino acids, out of the tubule fluid. The active transport of solutes out of the proximal convoluted tubule into the tissue fluid causes water to flow by diffusion. The water and solutes moved into the tissue fluid are taken up by the paratubular capillaries and returned to the venous blood, leaving the kidney. Despite the large volume of water and solutes reabsorbed out of the proximal convoluted tubule, the overall concentration or osmolarity of the fluid that enters the loop of Henle is similar to that of the blood plasma, although its composition is quite different. The ability of the kidney to produce urine that is hypertonic to the blood plasma is due to the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle does not concentrate the urine directly. Rather, it functions as a countercurrent multiplier, creating a concentration gradient in the surrounding medulla. To understand the countercurrent multiplier mechanism, it's easiest to move backward through the tubule, starting with the thick ascending limb. The thick ascending limb actively transports sodium ions from the tubule fluid and moves it into the surrounding tissue fluid. Chloride ions follow passively. The thick ascending limb is not permeable to water, so the reabsorption of sodium and chloride ions out of this part of the tubule is not followed by the outward diffusion of water. This reabsorption of sodium and chloride ions raises the concentration of solutes in the surrounding tissue fluid. The descending limb, in contrast, is permeable to water, but not very permeable to sodium and chloride ions. Since the surrounding fluid has been made more concentrated, water leaves the tubule by osmosis. As a result, the fluid in the descending limb becomes more concentrated as it flows toward the bottom of the medulla. The thin ascending limb is not permeable to water. It is, however, permeable to sodium and chloride ions. Since the tubule fluid is more concentrated than the surrounding tissue, sodium and chloride ions diffuse out. The thick ascending limb continues to move sodium and chloride ions to the medulla by active transport. As a result of this process, the tubule fluid reaching the distal convoluted tubule is less concentrated than the blood plasma, and the solutes that have been left behind in the renal medulla have created a concentration gradient in the surrounding tissue fluid. Since the fluid entering the distal convoluted tubule is less concentrated than the surrounding cortex, the tubule loses water osmotically as it flows toward the collecting duct. The tubule fluid entering the collecting duct is at the same concentration as the blood plasma. However, since sodium and chloride ions have been moved out of the tubule fluid, urea and other waste products make up a greater proportion of its total solute content. As the collecting duct descends from the cortex to the tip of the renal pyramid, the concentration gradient established by the loop of Henle increases. This increasing solute concentration causes more and more water to be absorbed from the fluid, thus concentrating the urine in the collecting duct.
So again, hopefully this animation kind of helps put everything together. I think this is a really nice animation for those of you that are having trouble visualizing what's happening in the nephron. So like I said, I will repost this animation separately along with the other one, so that way then you can get to those separately via Canvas. Okay, so that leaves us with just this very last bit of the lecture to talk about. So again, when we talk about our urine composition is going to vary from time to time, and it's going to reflect obviously the amount of water and solutes that the kidneys are eliminating at any point in time to help us maintain homeostasis. And remember, this is to help us maintain mainly homeostasis in the blood, to help us maintain certain ion concentrations and certain water concentrations within the blood. And so the kidneys, again, are very much responsible for that. And so they have a very important job. If you've ever known anyone that's been in kidney failure, without two functioning kidneys, oftentimes, the blood, because the kidneys are filtering again, ions in the blood and water in and out of the blood, this can throw many different things off. And so what can happen is, for example, and this is unfortunately happening to my grandfather right now because he's in kidney failure, because his one kidney is not working at capacity when it's not functioning well, then he has an ion imbalance in his blood, and that impacts brain function. So he gets very confused. Also, because he's not properly reabsorbing water, his blood pressure will get really high, and he'll start to, again, hold on to too much fluid in his tissues. So again, there are all kinds of problems that can occur if there is some type of disease within the kidneys. So urine is, again, going to be about, just to give you the composition of urine, it's about 95% water, okay? And then it also obviously contains some urea, uric acid, some trace amounts of amino acids, and then some other electrolytes. Again, things like hydrogen ions and potassium ions, even some sodium, a few sodium ions might make it in there. So urine elimination, this is our last bit of the lecture that we have to talk about, okay? After forming that filtrate in the nephrons, okay, then that filtrate, which is to become your urine, okay, is going to pass from the collecting ducts to the renal papilla, and then, and I'll show you this in just a minute, through the renal papilla, then to the minor calyx, major calyx, and out the renal pelvis, okay, to the ureters. And then from the ureters, then it's going to move into the urinary bladder, and finally to the outside world through the good old urethra, okay, which conveys that urine again outside. So let me see, I thought I had a picture of the kidneys here. You know what, let me go back out here real quick. I just want to take us out of this slide here for a second and go back and show you the slide, one of the slides of the kidneys. So that way then you know what we're talking about here as we talk about moving through the renal papilla. So excuse me for just one moment. I should have had that picture of the kidney there for you so that you could see this. So here we go. This will do. So again, here you can see here, and sorry I don't have my pointer so I can't draw on the side, but here would be the renal papilla right here. So all the collecting ducts are going to dump, and you can see this is a little in yellow, a nephron here, and those collecting ducts are going to dump into the very base here of the medulla called the renal papilla. And oops, sorry, I'm clicking things there. And then from here, these are the minor, this is a minor calyx, this is a minor calyx, this is a minor calyx. And actually, let me turn on my pen just so I can highlight this here. Oops, it's not going to let me do it because I'm not in the show. Sorry. But so here's the minor calyx, here's the minor calyx, here's the minor calyx. And they're going to dump into this right here would be the major calyx. Okay, and then it's going to dump into the renal pelvis here, which is this big collecting area. It's collecting, again, the urine from all of the major calyxes here, major calyces. And then the renal pelvis will dump into the ureter. Okay, and then we can go back now to where we were before, and I'll show you from the ureter where it goes. So let's see. So again, from the ureters, then we're going to go into the urinary bladder and then eventually out the urethra. So here, I can show you a picture of this here. Okay, so, and I'm going to turn back on my pen really quick. Sorry about this, guys. So if you look here, again, here are the kidneys, and so as, again, fluid enters the ureters, okay, then they'll go from there and then dump into the urinary bladder and then into the urethra. So oftentimes when you get kidney stones, you know, if you wonder where typically kidney stones are causing a blockage, usually the kidney stones are causing a blockage in the ureters somewhere, okay? So that's where usually you have the issues with kidney stones. So the ureters are these muscular tubes that are going to obviously again extend from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. And the wall of the ureter is going to be composed of 3 major layers: a mucus coating, okay, a muscular coat, and an outer fibrous coat. So those are the 3 linings. The mucus coat obviously being the inner lining and the fibrous coat being the outer lining. And that muscular coat in between is going to be important because the layers of muscle there are going to contract in these waves of contractions that we call peristaltic contractions to convey the urine from the kidneys into the urinary bladder. And once it reaches the urinary bladder, it will pass through this little flap-like a valve in the mucous membrane of the urinary bladder. Now the urinary bladder is going to be this hollow, distensible, obviously it has to be able to distend when it takes in fluid, distensible muscular organ that obviously in the pelvic cavity. And the internal floor of the bladder is going to include something called the trigon, which I'm going to show you in just a minute, which is going to be made up of the two openings where the ureters are coming into the bladder and then the urethra. So let me show you real quick. I'm just going to skip ahead and show you the trigon. So here's the trigon right here. Okay, it makes up this kind of triangle here. So here you have the two openings for the ureters, okay? And then down here is the opening for the urethra. So that's why this makes up the trigon. Now the wall of the urinary bladder is going to be made up of 4 coats. It's going to have an inner mucus coat, okay? And then a submucous coat. So again, this is that extra layer. And then it will also have a muscular coat and an outer serous coat. Now, this muscular coat is going to consist of a large muscle called the detrusor muscle. Okay? And a portion of that detrusor muscle that surrounds the neck of the bladder is going to form our internal sphincter muscle. Okay? So that detrusor muscle is going to be important for, one, holding, again, urine in, but then also when we need to release urine, you'll see that detrusor muscle is very important as well. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And then we have an outer serous coat. And so remember, again, serous means it's that fluid-filled membrane, okay, that lines this. And the reason that we have an outer serous coat is, again, because the bladder is going to be constantly, again, distending when it's full, and then, again, contracting back when it empties, because it's going to be moving in the pelvic cavity. We have a serous membrane to help prevent any friction between the bladder as it distends against surrounding organs and tissues. Okay, so, and again, you can see here's that detrusor muscle there. So now let's talk about, and we'll talk more about the detrusor muscle and micturition here. So micturition is literally the fancy name for urination, so the process for urination. And so literally how the urine leaves the bladder is what we call our micturition reflex. And what happens is the detrusor muscle is going to contract, and the external urethral sphincter will then relax. And that's what's responsible, again, for the micturition reflex. So obviously, again, the detrusor muscle has to contract. This big muscle around here has to contract to help push the urine, again, into the urethra. And then our external urethral sphincter, okay, which is going to be down here, will then relax and allow the fluid, the urine, to move, okay, from here on out. And so it's really this external urethral sphincter, okay, that's responsible for our bladder control. And, you know, sometimes after women experience a long labor, especially long labor of pushing, it can damage some of the perineal muscles and impact this external urethral sphincter. And so sometimes women will get leakage of urine after they, you know, have a child. Okay, so just kind of some interesting, again, information in terms of talking about the micturition reflex. Stretching of the urinary bladder is what actually triggers the micturition reflex center. So when, again, the bladder stretches to a certain point, that will stimulate that micturition reflex, which is located in the sacral portion of the spinal cord. So, and again, of course, you know, we have some override control on the external sphincter, but, you know, again, a certain stretch on the bladder is going to trigger that micturition reflex. Return parasympathetic impulses will also cause the detrusor muscle to contract in waves, and an urge to urinate will be sensed. Again, so we're going to get, when micturition happens, okay, we're going to get the sensation to urinate. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to urinate, because you have control over that external sphincter, again, unless you've had some damage to the perineal muscles. But for the most part, most people have control over that external urethral sphincter. So even though the micturition reflex may be occurring, you're not necessarily urinating until you release that external urethral sphincter. However, you will have the urge to urinate. When these contractions become strong enough, the internal urethral sphincter again will be forced open, and the external urethral sphincter is going to be composed of skeletal muscle and is under our conscious control. So the internal urethral sphincter again may be forced open, okay, at a certain point, but we still have control over that external urethral sphincter. So it's that external urethral sphincter that really is responsible for our, control of urination. The urethra, again, is just going to be a tube that conveys urine from the urinary bladder to the outside. And it's a muscular tube with what are called urethral glands that secrete mucus into the urethral canal. And again, that secretion of mucus helps to, again, basically to line the urethra so that way then, you don't have damage and friction occurring with fluid being pushed through that urethra. So now this is kind of the fun part of the lecture, this is where we can kind of finally talk about some diseases that occur. So kidney stones are going to be the first one that we're going to talk about. And kidney stones are these solid formations that occur within the kidneys. Usually they form from a buildup of ions such as calcium and oxalate. And pain will usually occur as the stones block, again, certain urinary pathways, especially when they block the ureters, or they may even become become mobile, and you can feel them as they're moving their way down. That's what we're talking about when we say pass a kidney stone. As they move their way down the ureters, that can be very, very painful. The causes for kidney stones are very variable. Sometimes it's dietary. Sometimes it's simply, morphological in terms of the makeup of the tissues in the kidneys and the ureters. And then there's also a lot of the kidney stones out there, we really don't know why they're forming in that individual. So there are unknown causes as well. Common treatments include shockwave lithotripsy, which literally blasts the stones, or if you want to say blows up the stones for passage, so it breaks them into smaller pieces so they can pass more easily. And so hopefully none of you have experienced kidney stones. I've heard they're quite painful, so those of you that have, I'm sorry. Okay, diuretics. So when we talk about certain diuretics, these are substances that slow reabsorption of water and cause diuresis. So again, if we're not reabsorbing that water, then more of that water is staying in the filtrate, and we're going to excrete more of that water. So that means, again, we're going to have an increased urine output and an increased urine flow rate. So let's talk about some of these diuretics. We talked about alcohol was a diuretic, okay? And again, remember, alcohol inhibits the secretion of antidiuretic hormone, so that's how it does that. Caffeine is also a diuretic, and it actually inhibits sodium reabsorption. So again, remember, if it's inhibiting sodium reabsorption, then if sodium's not being reabsorbed, then the water won't follow it, right? Because the water's moving down its osmotic gradient. So if we inhibit sodium reabsorption, we're inhibiting water reabsorption. And that means that more of the water is staying in the filtrate, and you'll have more water in your urine. So more urine output. And then there are also prescription medications that are prescribed as diuretics. So again, I told you my grandfather was in kidney failure, and he's on a diuretic to help maintain his blood pressure. And so again, that diuretic will act on the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, or the distal convoluted tubule, basically to help increase again decrease the water reabsorption. And again, it can do this by a number of mechanisms. It can inhibit sodium reabsorption, is one of the main ways that these medications can basically increase your urine output, or decrease again your water reabsorption back into the blood. So again, those are all examples of diuretics. Okay, glucosuria. We talked about there is no case in which you should be excreting glucose normally. unless you, for some reason, have an insane amount of glucose, meaning you've eaten way, way, way too much glucose. But for the most part, you should not have glucose in your urine. And so then if you do have glucose in your urine, okay, this is typically a sign of disease because 100% of your glucose should be reabsorbed, okay, back into the blood. So renal symporters cannot reabsorb glucose fast enough if blood glucose levels are above 200 milligrams per milliliter, okay? And this happens, again, more commonly in the case of diabetes. So again, if you have too much glucose in the blood, then you'll end up moving that glucose into the filtrate and you'll have too much glucose in the filtrate. And remember, again, those little protein transporters can only work so fast. And so they just can't work fast enough to reabsorb all of that extra glucose there. So some of the glucose will end up staying in the urine. So when we have glucose in the urine, this is called glucosuria. And the most common cause of this is obviously diabetes mellitus, especially when, again, insulin activity is deficient. And so remember, insulin helps us pull sugar out of the blood, okay, and store it. And so if we don't have, again, enough insulin activity, then the blood sugar levels rise too high and we end up with glucose in our urine. All right, well, that is the end of the urinary lecture. Again, I apologize for it having to be split into 3 parts. But I know this is a challenging lecture. It's a long lecture and a challenging lecture, and it's probably, honestly, the most difficult material that you're going to have for the exam. So please, please, please spend the time with the urinary system. I haven't been getting as many questions lately on Canvas associated with, content. So please, please feel free to ask questions. I'm begging. Ask questions about the urinary system as you go through this on Canvas, and I will answer your questions usually within 24 hours. All right, so thank you very much and have a good night.